Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay.
New College Faculty Conversations.
I'm Douglas Estes, Associate Professor of Religion at New College of Florida.
I'm Alicia Mercado-Harvey, Assistant Professor of Spanish and History at New College of Florida.
And I'm Bruce Gilley, Presidential Scholar in Residence here at the New College. This is where we will talk to the amazing faculty of the New College of Florida, their personal stories, what they teach, and the research they're doing, and why it matters, as well as their advice for today's college students.
So join us each week during the semester for thought-provoking dialogues with these fascinating scholars here in the Pompeii Room on our beautiful campus by the bay in sunny Sarasota, Florida.
We invite you to watch and listen, send your comments and questions, and get to know New College of Florida, the honors college of the State University system. And don't forget,
Go
Mighty Banyans!
Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay, the faculty podcast of New College of Florida. We're here in the beautiful Pompeii Room in College Hall. My name is Douglas Estes. I'm the Associate Professor of Religion at New College.
And I'm Dr. Bruce Gilley. I'm the Presidential Scholar in Residence here at the New College. And we're very thrilled to have today as our first podcast guest, Dr. David Allen Harvey, who is Professor of History and International Studies at the New College of Florida, and also the founding Dean of our new Great Books major. Dr. Harvey, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Maybe we just start a little bit to learn about you, who you are, how you got to be a professor here, and your journey to the present.
Sure. So I joined New College in 2000. I just finished my doctorate in modern European history at Princeton University. I'm a specialist in 18th and 19th century French history, and I've been here ever since. And in January of last year, President Corcoran appointed me to build our new Great Books program.
Is this something that you think has grown naturally out of your being a historian? Great Books means a lot of different things to a lot of people. What's the link between you being a professor of history and the Great Books?
So my primary specialization is in cultural and intellectual history, particularly history of the French Enlightenment. So it feels like a very natural connection to me.
So in your time here, what's your favorite class to teach?
I think my favorite class that I teach is the Old Regime and the French Revolution. It really gets into some of the time period and some of the key events that I also look at in my research. And it's just a really fascinating period and a turning point in modern history.
Good. So Dr. Harvey's new book is Tropical Despotisms, published by Cornell University Press. Tell us a little bit about the book and your motivations for writing it.
Okay, so this new book follows up on some topics that I first got into in my previous book, which is called The French Enlightenment and Its Others. That came out in 2012. Really what both books do is try to explore and understand some of the contradictions of the 18th century world. This was, as I've suggested, an age of enlightenment, an age of progress in many ways, but it's also a period characterized by war, by colonialism, and by slavery and the slave trade. So really kind of trying to understand some of those contradictions and some of the reform proposals that administrators, philosophers, travelers, writers, and so forth put forward for transforming both France and its overseas empire.
I think your first book was, as you've described it to us, more about the high culture debates in the French Enlightenment, and this one kind of takes it down to the administrative or the governmental level. So tell us more about the substance of what you're talking about here. Okay,
sure. So the vital context for understanding this, I think, is France's defeat in the 7 Years' War, which is 1756 to 1763. This is what in American history is often known as the French and Indian War. It's a major clash on three continents between France and Britain, as well as their allies. And it's where France loses Canada to the British. So this comes as a major shock to the French court and to French public opinion. So there's kind of a post-mortem on this. What went wrong? What do we need to change? How can we revitalize what remains of our empire, make it both more profitable to the nation, but also more sort of self-sustaining.
So one thing that I find interesting about your book and your research is that, let me preface it this
Sure.
way. As a non-historian myself, generally familiar with the contours of American history, but here you're dealing with specifically the French Caribbean. And in a way, it seems like maybe that it's a microcosm for what was going on in the larger Atlantic area. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, very much so. This is, I mentioned this is a vital turning point. So the 7 Years' War kind of marks the culmination of centuries of competition between the European powers for empire in the Americas and the Atlantic world, the British, the French, the Spanish, and so forth. But the war also, it settles that conflict, basically, the British win. But it also opens up a new period of tensions. We certainly know in North America, the efforts by the British Crown to essentially pay the war debts, getting the American colonists to pay their fair share, sets off the conflict that will lead to the War of American Independence. In France, in the French Caribbean, the issues are a little bit different. There's not really a significant pro-independence movement for a variety of reasons, but there are deep conflicts over taxation, militia service, and participation of colonists in government. So there are definitely parallels, I think, between what's happening in the British North American colonies and in the French Caribbean.
And so you're tracing here, in some ways, how those debates that come out of the 7 Years' War and France's defeat percolate not so much into the high culture, but into the sort of practical administrative questions of what we now know as Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe.
Right.
So what's the specific debates that they're having in these places after the war?
So there are several. One of them has to do with economics, that all of the European empires at this point are governed by mercantilism. That is, the colonies are only allowed to trade with the mother country. But there's a lively smuggling trade going on between British North America and the French Caribbean because their economies are interdependent. And so many colonists and their advocates in the government want trade liberalization to allow that trade to kind of come up into legality and be more profitable, more regularized. There are debates over administrative reform. The French colonies don't really have institutions of self-government in the same way that British North American colonies do. There are no legislatures or assemblies. Everything is decided by officials appointed from Versailles. And so some colonists want greater say in their government. And then finally, there's a whole host of questions around the issues of slavery and race. These are plantation societies where slaves make up 80 to 90% of the population. Now, this is a period when the morality of slavery is being called into question across the Western world, in many ways really for the first time, or certainly to an unprecedented degree. So there are a number of reform proposals to try to transition from enslaved labor to some sort of a sharecropping or wage labor arrangement, which of course pushes up against the vested interests of the planters and colonial merchants, which is why ultimately these efforts will fail.
So there's some similarities between the English-speaking Caribbean and the French-speaking Caribbean that is kind of also different from what was going on in the North Atlantic.
Right. So the demographics and the social structure of the Caribbean colonies, both French and British, are quite different from those of English North America. While slavery is legal throughout British North America prior to the Revolution, in the North as well as in the South, though many people aren't necessarily aware of that, the free colonists outnumbered slaves everywhere in North America except South Carolina, where it was about 50-50. And so this leads to a very different kind of social structure, a different economy. One of the questions that comes up in the reform debates, and I mentioned the British victory in the 7 Years' War, colonial militia fighting on the British side, George Washington and the Virginia regulars and so forth, play a major role in Britain's victory over France, and the French are very well aware of this. They're also concerned about strategic vulnerabilities of plantation societies. So in addition to the humanitarian issues that are raised, there are sort of practical, self-interested concerns about colonial security.
So it sort of becomes an irony then that this debate that you're tracing in this book about how a slave-based plantation society with an essentially kind of aristocratic ruling class uneasily trying to figure out how to reform itself ends up getting mirrored in the Confederacy, or what becomes the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Now, it's not a perfect comparison. It seems to me we're able to talk about how this debate was taking place here. Maybe, as you say, we're not as aware of a similar debate going on in the southern plantation states.
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon. The issue, as I mentioned, the issue of slavery and abolition is raised in the late 18th, early 19th century for a variety of reasons, philosophical, humanitarian, religious, economic. So these are debates that echo across the Atlantic world for a very long time. And the timetable of abolition stretches over about a century, from some of the newly independent northern states being the first to abolish slavery in the wake of the American Revolution, down to sort of the 1780s, down to Brazil, the last American society to abolish slavery in 1888.
Given the title of your book, Tropical Despotisms, as if we were to casually notice the title of your book, the word despot sounds like this really bad thing. But was there any value or in their system? What made it work?
So the title, and this is a term that I've coined for the book, it's really a play on Montesquieu's notion of Oriental despotism, which is central to Enlightenment political theory, drawing a distinction between what he saw as legitimate monarchy, governed by law, tradition, and shared values, particularly a sense of honor, and despotism, which he viewed as a system without principles, governing only by fear and by the caprice of the master. And Montesquieu uses this, and particularly invoking sort of the sultans of the Near East, as a rhetorical device for criticizing absolute monarchy in France. And what I found, and I was kind of surprised by this, looking at a lot of the discourse of colonial reformers in the French Caribbean, is that they use a lot of these same tropes. This particularly references to sort of Near Eastern society, sultans, harems, viziers, and so forth, to critique both the arbitrary authority of French colonial officials over the colonial community, and also the arbitrary authority of planters over the slaves who worked on their estates. So I found this invocation of Enlightenment political theory and debates about slavery and colonialism in the French Caribbean both surprising and really kind of fascinating. So that wound up being kind of the organizational thread of the book.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the Oriental despotism trope of Montesquieu, the Sultan, they're borrowing from the Ottoman Empire, right? Which is, in the European mind of that time, Asia was started at the Bosphorus, right? And the sultans of Turkey were the despots, and they were seen as indolent, and you can see the whole Orientalism idea about this. But basically, the idea was, they were capricious, lazy, corrupt, venal, all those bad things, and so. I guess what you're tracing here is, the planter society, they don't want democratization. That would lead to the enfranchisement of the black population.
Right.
They want a kind of what we would call a refined or a legitimate or a rule-bound form of despotism, as opposed to the Oriental or the illegitimate despotism.
Right. So, and a lot of the another presence, in this book, and this also comes out of, again, the spirit of sort of defeat recriminations after the 7 Years' War, calling for the renovation of civic virtue in quasi-republican terms, an outgrowth of national spirit and desire for a new imperial patriotism. But this is still very much the world of the old regime. It's not democratic in a modern sense. And the question of who belongs to this renovated national imperial community is actually a very highly contested one. And notably, kind of on the margins, there are debates about the role of a growing and increasingly prominent and successful free population of color. That is, at least some of the leading figures of that group are also calling for being included, for being granted sort of rights and privileges on the same terms as white colonists. And so issues of race, of sort of defining who is a citizen and who is not, are very much contested issues of the period.
Probably the offspring of those same white colonists who are the
Right.
reformers.
Oh,
so
yes, yes.
I get to vote, but not my son.
Right.
It becomes difficult to sustain, right?
Well, and it actually, there's one of the cases I go into in the book, and I've had an article come out in French Historical Studies on this, called the Chapuisat affair. There's a wealthy planter who's the remote descendant of slaves who files a lawsuit requesting an officer's commission in the colonial militia, which it's, he may have had something of a military vocation, but it's really sort of a way of saying, well, I want the same rights and privileges as my neighbors. And this becomes a very divisive issue at the time as all of these things play out.
So if students were interested in following up with this, what is the selling point for them? What is why should they care about the French Caribbean?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, the 18th century is a pivotal moment for the emergence of the modern world. As I mentioned, it marks the beginning of the end of an order of mercantilist empires and the rise of nation states. A lot of our modern ideas of race, as I was suggesting, of democratic citizenship, of nationhood, really derive out of this period. So I think it's sort of a pivotal moment in the emergence of the modern world order.
So when you were writing this, was there some story or some interesting thing that you'd never heard of that came out of the research here?
So I found a lot of really fascinating anecdotes, which I think history, historia derives from story, and so we are all ultimately storytellers. One fascinating one that I came across was involved the Marquis de Lafayette, obviously the hero of both the American and French revolutions. He obviously comes from an aristocratic background in France. He first encounters the institution of slavery in his service in North America, and it deeply troubles him. He becomes one of the first abolitionists in France in the years immediately before the French Revolution. And so he actually invests in several plantations in French Guiana. He's an absentee landlord, he never goes there. But his goal is to try to convert the slaves on these estates into wage laborers to demonstrate that slavery isn't necessary for the economics of the plantation system to work. Now, he ran into a number of practical difficulties, and then the French Revolution cut the experiment short. But I found that a really fascinating story.
Yeah. Slavery as a stepping stone to freedom, in a way. Now, students may want to know, what does a historian do when they write a book? Did you sit in libraries? Did you talk to people? How did you research this book, and how did it come together?
So I did most of the research on several summer trips to France. I went to the French colonial archives, which are in Aix-en-Provence in southern France, as well as the National Library in Paris. So I gathered a lot of material. One of the cool things about doing research in the 21st century is we have so much technology to help us. So a fair number of the materials had been digitized, and so I was able to access them remotely from here. But a lot of other things, and these are literally sort of big boxes of dusty old handwritten documents. I have an app on my phone that I could just scan them to PDFs and then bring them back here to sort of work through. But it's a lot of, one of my professors once said, historians are people who like reading other people's mail. So a lot of the sources I looked at were administrative correspondence between the ministry in France and officials on the ground in the Caribbean. So I've got thousands of pages of materials like that I would read through and piece together, find the details, reconstruct the stories, and build this into the narrative of the story that I wanted to tell.
Was there a kind of moment in writing this book where this kind of middle-level debate, as we've called it, crystallized in your mind? Or did you go into this saying, okay, I'm going to study the administrative kind of governance debate in the French Caribbean?
It definitely, I guess I would describe it as sort of a kaleidoscopic effect, that when you first start looking at the material, it's just very confusing and jumbled. And as you read through it and take notes and sort of think about it, the picture gradually comes into focus. So I went into it obviously with some ideas of what I was hoping to find, why I found this question interesting, but the interpretation I came out with, and particularly this idea of tropical despotism and the relevance of Enlightenment social and political thought to colonial debates in the Caribbean, that wasn't something I went into this project with. That was sort of an idea that caught in my mind as I was working through the material and made it all kind of make sense and come into focus for me.
Because I see a trilogy coming here. I see a kind of Dr. Harvey's high culture book, Dr. Harvey's administrative level culture book, and the one we'll all be waiting for is Dr. Harvey's low-level culture book.
Well, there is another book in the works. It's not exactly that. I was originally wanting to look at essentially all of France's colonial projects during this time period. But the book wound up being focused on the Caribbean because everything else didn't really fit. So there was there were a number of basically failed attempts at creating new colonies in South America, in the Falkland Islands, in Madagascar, in the Indian Ocean. And so the next book is going to be looking at those essentially failed projects, which are interesting because they do take place within the context both of this general reform effort as well as the spirit of the late Enlightenment. And the argument for that book, at least going into it, I think, is that a lot of the failures of the 18th century helped to shape the imperial vision of Republican France in the 19th and 20th centuries, this idea of a mission to civilize.
So I note that you also, besides being a professor of modern history, you also are the dean of the Great Books program here at New College. Can you tell us a little bit about that program? What makes it special?
So I think what makes it special is that we want to introduce students to big ideas, great debates that have gone on across the centuries. The great books really are sort of the shared cultural heritage of humanity. And this is a program that transcends the usual disciplinary boundaries. Students will study history, political theory, philosophy, literature, and so forth, and looking both to kind of understand the Western cultural tradition from classical antiquity to the present, but also the place of the West in the world and its relation to other cultural traditions as well.
Now, Dr. Harvey, as you know, the mention of great books among the bien-pensants of contemporary culture typically elicits a great eye roll and a moan. and a comment to the extent that are you teaching dead white male reactionary oppressive narratives? Why not define great books in a more diverse way? What kind of program are you running here? Are we going to tar you and feather you as a reactionary in the academy?
I certainly hope not. You know, I think, well, to some degree, inevitably, you reify the idea of quote unquote great books by building a program around it. And you maybe make this seem more homogenous than it really, in fact, is. The great books tradition also includes some of the great radicals of history, some people who challenged the status quo of their times and helped shape the modern world that we live in. Also, as I was mentioning, I really do see this as something that doesn't belong to a particular race, nation, or creed, but really belongs to all of humanity. As far as I know, I don't have any Greek or Roman ancestors. My ancestors were sort of barbarians wandering the forests of the British Isles when Plato and Aristotle wrote. But this tradition belongs to me as well. It belongs to anyone who cares to engage in this sort of ongoing dialogue with the great minds of the past.
That's the Glenn Lurie argument, right? Like the great books are my great books as much as your great books. They're everyone's great books. That's why we teach them.
Well, they are. And, one of my, a quote that I really like by the great French medieval historian Marc Bloch is that history is a dialogue between the past and the present. And so the canon of great books is an ever-changing one because we are changing. The questions we ask of the past change. But I think that it's important to, if you want to understand the contemporary world, to know how did we get here? How did society become the way it is? What were the roads not taken? What alternatives are there? So, my hope in this is not to sort of put great books up on a pedestal and have students bow before them, but really to sink their teeth into these things, so to speak, and to learn to think deeply about big questions.
Yeah. One thing that makes your work here special, if not unique, is that we've seen over the last several decades a contraction in the humanities departments and a move away from the great books.
Yeah, that's very true. And those of us who follow these developments in the Chronicle of Higher Ed and other publications, it's really very troubling. You hear about humanities programs being shuttered as students, and understandably so, in the society we live in, feel that they need to study something practical so that they can get a good job and make a lot of money. And I don't discount those motivations. That is important. But the 4 years of a college education pass very quickly. You've got the whole rest of your life to continue to learn and grow. And what a humanistic liberal arts education can do is to help make you into a lifelong learner, to learn how to think, how to ask big questions. And then you can take those skills and go on to whatever profession you choose to enter into.
And I think it's countercultural even in a deeper sense now, in a more contemporary sense of people not reading. And
Absolutely.
It's almost, we'll need to have a little asterisk by great books. A book is a printed document with lots of words that you spend some time on, because that's almost a second challenge to the program. It's not just the commitment to the humanities and to the great books, but the commitment to reading.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who's really a lifelong bibliophile, it's very sad to me that fewer and fewer young people today just really read for pleasure or know what it is to kind of turn off your phone, shut out the distractions, and just really plug in and read a good book for several hours at a stretch. So. And those are habits of mind that are really important and that I want to do what I can to cultivate among our students.
Well, we're really excited to have Professor David Allen Harvey with us this week for Faculty Conversations. His new book is Tropical Despotisms from Cornell University Press.
Any last words in our closing minutes to today's students? Why should they come to college anyway? Why should they come to New College? What is this place that we're encouraging them to visit for 4 years?
So New College of Florida is a really special place. We are a small community of people faculty, students, and staff who care deeply about learning and ideas. And a lot of big universities you can go to, and you can get a good education at places like that, but there's a real risk of getting lost in the shuffle. You may be taught primarily by teaching assistants rather than full-time professors. At New College, you'll have a chance to really get to know your faculty and advisors, to engage deeply with important topics in small classes, with other bright and eager students. It really is a wonderful experience, and I invite everyone to check us out.
Okay, so if you want to get in touch with Dr. Harvey, we'll make sure to put a link to his direct email in the podcast, and make sure to follow up with him if you have questions. Another thing about New College is our faculty are very accessible.
Well, it was great to have Professor David Allen Harvey here today. His new book is Tropical Despotisms by Cornell University Press for our weekly New College Faculty Podcast.
And as we always say,
Go
Mighty Banyans!